Hello everyone and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're going to be focusing on the new family and domestic violence regulation. By introduction, my name is Tanya Evans and I'm the CEO and founder of WorkPro. And for those that don't know WorkPro, hadn't heard of WorkPro, our specialist area is in making sure that you can administer and deliver and monitor workforce compliance as simply as possible and making sure that we set a high standard. It is designed to get candidates work ready quickly and to keep them work ready. So everything from pre-employment screening right through to collecting accreditations, license and tickets and delivering important e-learning. My guest today is Georgie Chapman. Welcome Georgie and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tanya.
Excellent, I can hear you, that's nice. Georgie is a lawyer and a partner with HR Legal. Georgie and Georgie's firm specialise in industrial relations, litigious and non-litigious employment and workplace relations, with a particular emphasis around industrial relations, discrimination and occupational health and safety. Georgie and I have known each other for a wee while and I was particularly keen to grab Georgie to talk about this important and sensitive subject, particularly around the change in legislation. Georgie is very pragmatic, a very passionate advocate and very knowledgeable around the subject of family and domestic violence. So she's the perfect subject matter expert for today's session. I'm just going to move on to the little agenda today. So just to keep us on track, Georgie and I will spend about 20 minutes or so. We will have a Q&A at the end. If there is a number of questions, please just take the opportunity to pop them in the chat window or the questions window and we will try and get to them before the end of the session. If we run over, we'll record those questions and answers and we'll also send those out along with the live webinar, along with the recording, sorry, of today's webinar. So the agenda is Georgie's going to cover off an overview of FDV and the impacts, the new leave under the National Employment Standard, considerations, so this is the practical strategies. This is their considerations including confidentiality, flexible work arrangements and how you manage and administer the new leave entitlements. Work health and safety considerations for those on the call. And also, I guess, it's such a sensitive subject. So super keen, Georgie, and I know we have a couple of questions already prepared, but super keen to hear from you about how we navigate or how the audience navigates family and domestic violence, how to identify, how to approach and how to manage not just the administration, but having conversations and supporting the workers through family and domestic violence situations. So we get moving.
Absolutely, sounds good.
Excellent, thank you. All right, over to you, Georgie.
Thanks very much. So thanks for having me today. And look, as Tanya said, this is a complex and sensitive topic and subject matter. So I do want to put it out there. We'll be having a bit of a context setting, couple of slides around what is family and domestic violence. And then we'll get into some of those practicalities around the law and what's required of employers. So I think it is worth exploring in our context setting around the sorts of behaviours that can be family and domestic violence, because I think traditionally when we're thinking about FDV, we think about those more overt physical kind of behaviours, and absolutely they fall within that definition. But they are on the spectrum of a lot of different types of behaviours, and you may have workers within your workplaces who are experiencing any number of these sorts of behaviours or dynamics in their personal relationships. Now on the screen there we've got a definition under some Victorian legislation. It's the Family Violence Protection Act. This is legislation that gives rise to the imposition of family violence orders, which are in effect civil instruments, but they can become criminal if they're breached. So it's sort of in that intervention order space. there are different pieces of legislation in each state and territory, but I just think this is a useful definition to look at because it does look at those different kinds of behaviours. So there is on that spectrum those physical type behaviours and sexually abusive behaviours that I foreshadowed, but it can also be behaviour that is emotionally or physically abusive, economically abusive, threatening or coercive, or in any other way dominates or controls that family member or causes the family member to feel fear for the safety or well-being of the family member or another person. And it also extends to behaviour that causes a child to hear or witness or otherwise be exposed to the effects of the above. So it is a really broad spectrum, as I say, and sometimes it might be that you have members of your team that are experiencing more subtle forms that they might themselves not recognise as family and domestic violence. And I think that really underscores how complex this subject matter is and how delicate it is when we're trying to support a team member around this.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for that overview, Georgie.
Yeah, thank you. So again, in terms of that context setting, I've got a bit of statistics around family and domestic violence. And this, on the screen, we've got some stats that come from Relationships Australia from 2015. So it's not super recent. And as I'm sure some of you might already be thinking, that's pre-pandemic data, and I will talk to the impacts of pandemic briefly in a moment. But Relationships Australia, for those of you who don't know them or are not familiar with them, they do some fantastic work around family and domestic violence and have some great resources. So in your own time, suggest you have a look at some of the materials they have. But some of the statistics, family and domestic violence is the leading cause of death, disability and illness in Australian women aged 15 to 44. So that is profound, I think, alarming and, you know, really pause for consideration, I think, for us in the workplace, but of course in the community more broadly. It impacts an estimated 1 in 6 female workers in Australia. And a further 1 in 5 women report that aspects of the family and domestic violence continue while they attend work. So it's not just necessarily behaviours or experiences that are happening in the home or outside of work. It can continue while at work. So that might be, for instance, they're continuing to receive text messages, emails, phone calls. It might be that there's, you know, stalking technology on their devices. So while they're at work, they're being monitored by the perpetrator. It might be the perpetrator's presenting at the workplace. So there's any number of ways that that can continue at work, which I think really underscores the intersect with the workplace that we'll talk to a bit more in a moment. And finally, family and domestic violence is estimated to cost Australian businesses $465 million every year. There can be all sorts of contributing factors there. It can be things like unplanned absences. It can be presenteeism, where people are presenting to work but understandably are perhaps not at their full capacity because of the impacts of family and domestic violence and the flow-on effects to others, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I do want to make a couple of comments around these stats, if I can. The first is that we're talking about women. This is largely an issue that impacts women, but of course it impacts men as well. Men can experience family and domestic violence, so I do want to flag that. But predominantly it more broadly impacts women. As I said before, this is pre-COVID data, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the increase in experience of family and domestic violence on account of the impacts of pandemic. What we tend to see in the community more broadly is with real unexpected disasters, those sorts of impacts. So things like natural disasters, bushfires, pandemic, what we can see is a spike in the instance of family and domestic violence. So some stats that have come out from the Australian Institute of Criminology was that 8.8% of women in a relationship experienced violence from a partner. This was reported in 2020. 1 in 3 of women reported it was the first time they'd experienced violence in their relationship, and emergency department presentations for family and domestic violence related assaults increased by 91% between May 2020 and May 2021. And that's when we saw, to a large extent, presentations drop off in lots of other respects because people were avoiding emergency departments on account of the pandemic, but it was actually going up, FDV. So really sobering statistics, and I think really underscores the importance of us taking steps within our community more broadly, but certainly also within the workplace, which is what we'll explore now.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to be speaking about I guess post-pandemic, when there is a rise in the hybrid working arrangements. I know you're going to touch on the working from home arrangements, so we'll cover a little bit about that a little later on. Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks, Tanya.
No problem.
So very briefly, just focusing in on the impacts for both the workplace and team members. So what we tend to see for team members is there are those impacts where, you know, they can continue to experience family and domestic violence in the workplace. There are profound impacts on wellbeing, mental health in terms of self-esteem and confidence, and of course the development of mental health conditions. That has a flow-on effect, understandably, in terms of their performance and, of course, their safety at work, not just on account of the continued experience of family and domestic violence, but if they're in more safety-critical roles, that can all have a flow-on effect to their safety at work. It impacts their interpersonal relationships within the workplace, and there can be an increased use of leave and unplanned absences on account of those impacts. What we see often is lower average income impacting the ability to leave the relationship, although of course there's no standard person or type of demographic that experiences family and domestic violence. It can, you know, impact anyone. And then often what happens as a result of all those impacts is unsustained employment for that team member, because it's very difficult to maintain their employment as a result.
Yeah.
There is, of course, very real impacts at the workplace level. You know, we just talked about unsustained employment. That then leads to increased staff turnover and, you know, managing high absenteeism, usually without prior warning. There can be impacts on productivity, which then has a flow-on effect for others in the workplace. So increased workplace demands for other team members. On some occasions, we see misuse of company resources. It might be that there's an over-reliance for that person who's experiencing family and domestic violence, because work is often a really safe space for them. We can also see misuse of company resources where there are perpetrators in the workplace. We do need to acknowledge that if we have 1 in 6 female workers experiencing FDV, particularly for larger organisations, chances are there could be some perpetrators in the workplace as well. And sometimes they're misusing company resources to perpetrate the FDV as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. Emotional impact on team members. So if they're aware of family and domestic violence, no, you're right, that can actually be quite a heavy burden for them to bear in that support role, particularly if they're not sure how they should be supporting that person. There can be increases in low morale in the team, and also safety risks for all team members, whether it's because of that increased work demands or it's because potentially perpetrator is presenting or contacting the workplace. So substantial impacts there.
Yeah.
So
thank you. And
in terms
to,
this recognition of FDV as a workplace issue, what we've seen over the last decade or so is that Australian workplaces have really started to recognise the need to take action in this space. So what we were seeing is, under workplace policies or enterprise agreements, individual workplaces were adopting paid leave entitlements around family and domestic violence, and often that's what we see. You know, there are that community movement, and then the law tends to catch up after that. So what we first saw as a development was in 2018, the Fair Work Commission made provision for unpaid family and domestic violence leave under modern awards, and then that was adopted as a national employment standard, so for all employees in 2018 December. And then there was a decision last year in May by the Fair Work Commission that there should actually be paid leave under modern awards. Now, modern awards apply to a lot of Australian employees, but not everyone. But that the implementation was stalled because the very new government that had been elected had made part of their platform as legislating paid family and domestic violence leave, and that then followed. And as many of you would be aware, that commenced on the 1st of February of this year for all employees other than those of small business employers and that will commence for them on the 1st of August 2023, this year. So that's a fairly huge development, I think, and I see one as a really positive development. I know it's one that is of concern to some employers, but hopefully our discussion today may allay some of your fears to some extent about how this is going to work. But certainly some studies, recent studies around people experiencing family and domestic violence have said that some of the really critical supports from workplaces are paid leave, but also things like flexibility in the workplace and also some planning around their safety at work. So we'll talk about those in due course.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the great summary. Thank you.
So in terms of the family and domestic violence leave that's been legislated now, under the National Employment Standards, all employees are entitled to paid family and domestic violence leave of 10 days per annum. And as I said, this is commencing in August for small business employers. So that's employers with less than 15 employees headcount. Now, it is really important to note this is available to all employees, so irrespective of whether they're full-time, part-time or casual. So normally casuals don't get paid leave, but they will be entitled to paid family and domestic violence leave. And for existing employees, this starts from the 1st of Feb, as I said before, and so they'll be entitled to 10 days up front. And then when they get to their 12-month anniversary, then that's when it sort of renews effectively. So there is that sort of transitional arrangement, and it's payable at the full rate of pay. So the full rate of pay is effectively the base rate of pay, so what they get as their base salary or their base hourly rate, but also includes any particular incentive-based payments or loadings, monetary allowances, overtime penalty, those sorts of things that would have been payable for that particular day's work had they been on. So for a casual, for instance, if they'd been rostered on that particular day, they would get paid what they would have got paid had they worked that particular shift. And it's available if the employee is experiencing family and domestic violence and they need to do something to deal with the impact of the family and domestic violence, and it's impracticable for them to do that particular thing during or outside of working hours, I should say. So it might be, for instance, they need to attend a particular appointment. They might need to go to a bank, for instance, if they're working, 9 to 5 hours, they need to go to a bank to open their own bank account. That might be difficult to do outside of working hours and those sorts of things. Might be going to medical appointments, appointments with a lawyer, attending court appointments and the like. So it's where they're unable to do those things outside of work.
Yep, thank you.
And in terms of substantiating leave taken, if it's required by the employer, the employee is required to provide evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that the leave is taken for the reason that's stated. So that might be things like medical certificates, confirmation of appointments, a police report, evidence that they're attending a court hearing or what have you. What I would say is it's really critical to exercise discretion in terms of when you require that substantiation or evidence. In some cases, depending where they're on that journey of, taking steps towards dealing with the family and domestic violence, there might be, less evidence that they're able to provide. And also, if we're taking a very, formalised approach, sometimes that can undermine the trust or the sense of safety in having these sensitive conversations and what have you. So just exercise discretion in terms of when you require that information and the like. And really important given the sensitivity of the subject matter. Employers have to take steps to ensure that information concerning the notice or evidence of taking FDV leave is treated confidentially so far as is reasonably practicable. And there's also an additional new regulation around that the employer must not use that information other than for satisfying themselves that they're taking, the leave as asserted, unless the employee consents otherwise, unless they're required to do something by law, or if it's necessary to protect the health, safety or life of a person, including that employee or another person. So obviously if there was a safety critical scenario, they need to get that person help, then that might be appropriate to make a disclosure, but otherwise it's really critical that confidentiality is maintained. There's also some payslip requirements. So the payslip must not mention that the person is taking paid family and domestic violence leave. And that was something really critical that came out from the stakeholders in the process of reviewing this proposed legislation, that if there could be a compromise to the employee's safety if the payslip was to say that they were taking paid family and domestic violence leave. It may be that the perpetrator has visibility of those payslips, and so the regulations currently stand that payslips should indicate that it's miscellaneous leave or other leave or special leave or something of that nature. And important, I think, when discussing arrangements with the employee to notify them that that's how it will be dealt with on the payslip, just so they understand that. So yeah, it's been quite detailed in terms of how they've looked at implementing the machinery around the taking of paid family and domestic violence leave.
Yeah, and I know I've got a question from the audience that I'll talk to you about at the end of the session that relates specifically around those payslip requirements and if a perpetrator can have visibility of that payslip. So I'll just mention that now.
For sure, no worries. Thanks, Tanya.
And flexible working arrangements.
Yeah, as I foreshadowed, some of the feedback has certainly been that it's not just the taking of leave that's really critical, but it's also flexibility in work. And there has been recognition under the National Employment Standards that employees who've completed 12 months of continuous service, including regular and systematic casuals, are able to make requests for flexible working arrangements if they're experiencing family and domestic violence, or if they're providing care or support to immediate family member or household member who require support because they're experiencing family and domestic violence. Now, requests for flexible working arrangements aren't a right to have that accommodated as of right, but there are certain obligations that flow when that request is made. So employers need to respond within 21 days and they need to notify the employee whether it's accommodated or not. If they're unable to accommodate that request, they need to provide reasons based on reasonable business grounds as to why they can't accommodate it. And there are some additional obligations under modern awards that I'll talk to in a moment. So it might be that employee is looking for flexibility in terms of their working hours. They might want to move from full-time to part-time. They might want to look at a different working location. And it's really important to note that when we're looking at flexible working arrangements, as with them in any sort of context, they don't have to be set in stone forever. You can look at temporary arrangements, and I would suggest in this context, often what's required at a particular point in time won't necessarily be required forever and a day. So yeah, permanently. So worth looking at temporary arrangements just in consultation with the employee. And as I said, there have been some changes made to awards back in December 2018 around flexible working arrangements. They effectively require particular steps to be taken when an employer is making requests. And effectively they reflect what is best practice and what is going to be then enshrined in the Fair Work Act in due course. And that's really about sitting down and trying to generally reach an agreement around flexible work and having a discussion about what alternatives might look like if that particular request can't be accommodated, and setting out what that alternative might look like. So back in the day, requests for flexible working arrangements were an exchange of paper. No one actually had discussions. This is really just encouraging people to sit down and discuss, and particularly given the sensitivity here and the require for support, I think it's really important that people do sit down and have these discussions and try and nut out what might meet the needs of each of the parties.
Yeah, no, all good points, thank you.
And finally, work health and safety. I have flagged that there can be ongoing work health and safety issues for both the person experiencing family and domestic violence and for people at the workplace more broadly. As I'm sure we're all aware, employers or PCBUs, persons conducting a business or undertaking, have an overarching obligation to provide and maintain, so far as is reasonably practicable, a safe working environment. And part of that is proactively identifying hazards and eliminating risks so far as is reasonably practicable, not just managing issues when they're raised. And a really key component of safety obligations is monitoring health of employees. And of course, when we're talking about health and safety, we're talking both physical and psychological health and safety. And that monitoring health piece is really critical for employees experiencing family and domestic violence, because often there can be that reluctance to have conversations, or perhaps that lack of awareness that what's going on is in fact family and domestic violence. So important that we're really upping the stakes more broadly in terms of psychological health and safety, and making that workplace a psychologically safe environment where people do feel like they can have conversations about wellbeing. Part of that is really upping the stakes in terms of your managers and your leaders' ability to notice early warning signs around wellbeing. And some of those early warning signs, look, that's a whole conversation in that could, take hours, but a lot of it is similar in terms of employees who are experiencing poor mental health. So it's looking for a change in behaviour and engagement, in performance, those sorts of things, and asking the question, is there something else going on here? And trying to have conversations at an early stage. Now, really important, as you flagged before, Tanya, impacts of the pandemic. We have a lot more remote work now, and it's important to acknowledge that the workplace is much broader than we traditionally understood it to be. It's not just, the physical premises that everyone, meets on. It could be individual homes or other work sites. And this can create real challenges for people experiencing family and domestic violence, because if their home is the workplace, at least some of the time, then they could be experiencing family and domestic violence directly while they're working. Trying to have really good lines of communication, including when someone's working from home, that might actually inform how we're supporting people when they're working from home. And there can be all sorts of ways of doing this, including if there is awareness that someone experiences that from home, trying to make plausible explanations for why they need to be in the office more, or the other working environment where there is direct supervision and they're not going to be at home with that person. But also there's the ways of creating a safety language, for example, of having coded emojis, things like that, where there can be ways that that person's able to notify that they're experiencing something without it being directly visible to the perpetrator if they are working from home. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach in this sort of space, but certainly we do need to be considering that where we've got someone who we know is experiencing family and domestic violence and they're working from home. If we don't know, but we've got suspicions, the sorts of things to look out for are the same again for, potential mental health distress. It's things like turning their screen off frequently when they're on team meetings where they'd normally have it on, being less available, not responding as readily, those sorts of things that might give cause for having that wellbeing check-in and what have you. So really important that leaders are keeping that front of mind where they're managing those sort of hybrid arrangements.
Yeah. And again, I've got a question from the audience that I've just noted that I will ask you about at the end as well, that relates to working from home arrangements.
Sure.
Just flagging it.
So in terms of some of the practical strategies around this, if we have someone who we know is experiencing family and domestic violence, if they are going to be seeking a family violence intervention order, encouraging them to list the physical workplace as a prohibited location. Also considering what are appropriate security measures at the work premises, things like security passes for worker-only areas, sign-in procedures, surveillance and the like. With the permission of the employee who's experiencing the FDV, alerting reception or relevant staff to the family violence intervention orders and providing photo ID of the perpetrator, really critical in case that person is presenting at the workplace. And, I've certainly heard of situations where the reception person isn't aware and just calls the employee and says, you've got a visitor, and they don't know that that person shouldn't be at the workplace. Having clear reporting procedures for incidents of violence or threats are really important if they're occurring in the workplace, but also on a practical level, sometimes having that confidential record of those, if the person is then going through legal proceedings at a later date, that can actually assist them to have that record of things that have happened, because they might not be in a position to be making lists when they're experiencing it and the like. Also considering how they're, arriving at work, so safe parking spaces so that, close to the entrance if possible and well-lit areas, if appropriate, escorting them to their vehicle, obviously always offering to do that. It's not something that we impose on them. Looking, if they don't have their own car, at things like cab charge, Uber vouchers and those sorts of things. And also looking at developing individual safety plans, so sitting down with them and understanding what is important to them, what would be supportive to them, and really nutting out some of those practicalities, so that there is that sense that the workplace is taking a tailored approach to keeping them safe at work and also providing that support to them. So just a few ideas there. I'm sure there's probably more questions that have been raised when I've mentioned some of those. But I think they're really good conversation starters, so people can start thinking about how this works in practice.
Yeah, no, I thought, again, you're very pragmatic as a lawyer. So I was thinking of those, thinking as a business owner, I could absolutely apply those strategies. They're incredibly practical. Thank you.
No worries.
And question time. So I do have a few questions, and I know I can see in the chat there's quite a few as well, but
Sure.
I have prepared a couple of questions that I'd been asked by quite a number of the attendees today, even before today's session. So if you wouldn't mind, and it comes down to really, and I've actually written this one down, so it's about approaching a conversation. So most of us won't be psychologists, we're business owners and managers. And so I guess from your experience, how could you give us some advice around how you would approach a conversation for someone to feel, to have that conversation around their situation around family and domestic violence? Because that's really ultimately where it starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the critical things to start with is acknowledging no one's expected to be, a clinician, a psychologist, an expert in this space. And I think if you're approaching the conversation from a place of care, you're really starting it in the right mindset. Obviously, I mean, a lot of the things in our care conversations when someone has potentially a mental health condition apply in these circumstances. So firstly, making sure that you're in the right mindset for having that conversation. You're not about to rush to another meeting. You're not in open plan, all those sorts of things. And then I think trying to adopt an inquisitive or curious and non-judgmental approach. So one thing that often comes up in this space is that that person might not be ready to talk or recognise what's going on as family and domestic violence or problematic. They might not be ready to leave that relationship, even though you think that's what they should be doing. So really, it's just trying to create a safe space to hear from them, and also talk about what appropriate or practical workplace supports might be provided. So I think, if they haven't made a disclosure yet, but you've noticed some things, creating a space to say, hey, I'm a bit concerned about you. This is what I've observed. Is there anything that you want to share with me? This obviously keep it confidential. I'm just concerned about you. And if they sort of make some observations about what they've been experiencing, I think reinforcing their experience really critical is that you believe them, you know, and accept what they're saying on face value, and just say, you know, that sounds really awful. I'm really sorry you're experiencing that. Maybe asking some questions about, does this continue while you're at work? What sorts of things can we provide support? You know, actually maybe giving them some information about what you have in the workplace, around leave or what have you, or flexible working arrangements, but asking what would be helpful to you, because really we can't solve it for them without hearing from them what they need. So I think it's just really trying to have a supportive conversation. You know, depending on where they're at, they might say, you know, I don't know where I can get help or what I should be doing. And, you know, if you've got some of the community organisations that might be able to be, they might be referred to, that can be really helpful. And otherwise just talking about what they need while they're at work, inviting them to come to you if they need to have a chat. If you've got things like employee assistance programs, reminding them of access to those. And, you know, it's always worth, you know, when we've got developments like this in the law, talking to your EAP provider proactively as to whether they have any specific FDV services available, because if they're there, then that's really great to be able to refer to. So I guess being prepared to have a difficult conversation, being in the right mindset, and then just really being prepared to hear from them, and not having the solution already formed in your mind because you're not really sure where that conversation's going to go.
Yeah, and from a compliance point of view and a regulatory point of view, and this comes back to evidence, I suppose, are those conversations, are they supposed to be recorded?
You don't have to record them. I think you can take confidential notes after the conversation. I wouldn't be transcribing as you're writing, because you want to be present in that conversation, and there might, or it's likely to be, a sense of, you know, what's happening with those notes, if that employee is sharing some really sensitive things with you. So you do need to make a record of the leave that is taken, family and domestic violence leave, and that's separate to what goes in the pay slips. But as per those sorts of conversations, I think less is more. You can take some confidential notes to remind yourself as a leader afterwards, but make sure that they're stored securely and the like.
Excellent, thank you very much. The other one is around policy. Right, so yes, this has all been amazing information, and now it comes to the implementation and the development and implementation of policies. Do you have any advice around the development of policies, Georgie?
Yeah, look, I think important to have that as part of your policies. So certainly having provision for what the leave looks like, but also some of the other practicalities around flexible work arrangements, the availability of those, who people should be going to have conversations. I think, you know, more, I won't say elaborate, but more in-depth policies might look at other things in terms of, are there provisions for perpetrators and what might happen to perpetrators in the workplace? What sort of external supports are available as well as internal, so EAP, but then external support, whether it's Relationships Australia, other community-based organisations, and they're different ones in each state and territory, those sorts of things, so that it's not just you get this leave at the end and the person's left thinking, well, who do I talk to? You know, what's going to happen if I take leave, and how will it be managed? So really thinking about some of those practicalities, and thinking from the perspective of someone who wants to avail themselves of those supports, and what would they need to know, but also making sure that once you've developed that policy, that people who will be administering the policy understand how that works in practice, how the confidentiality works, all those sorts of things. Really important, so that it is set up for success.
Yeah. A question in relation to remote workplaces. So there's a number of organisations that have 100% working from home.
Yes.
And how would you cater? What, in your experience, how are organisations catering for those kinds of arrangements where it's not possible for a victim of family domestic violence to work permanently 100% from home?
Yeah, look, it is really tricky in those circumstances. And I think one of the really important things in terms of meeting your safety obligations is that you are taking steps to have good communication. If there are ways of having meetings where that person, if you're able to go for a walking meeting, meet somewhere else, it might not be an office per se, but able to have conversations where it won't be overheard or tracked, by a potential perpetrator in the home. Obviously, your safety obligations apply so far as is reasonably practicable. And if someone is working from home and that's your organisation and everyone works remotely, we can't control everything in that home environment. And so I think there needs to be that monitoring. There needs to be conversations and communication avenues. Ideally, if there's someone that you have concerns about, it will be difficult to have those conversations if they're in the home. So, if you can sort of say, hey, I need to go out for a walk today, so I move. So let's have a phone call where we're both moving. Why don't you go, as well? And trying to nut it out those sorts of ways. There are some practical ways you can try and have those sorts of conversations, but it is really difficult. And I think it's trying to think outside the square a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a fair comment. The other one is that I know this is not, family domestic or paid family and domestic violence leave is not new to you, and it's not new to many organisations. So one of the questions that has been raised with me a couple of times prior to this webinar is, are the floodgates going to open? And I know that you've had experience with this because we've had a chat about it, but it'd be great for the audience to hear from you because that may be a concern for some organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand the concerns. Every time we see a paid leave entitlement being legislated, there is the concern about how we're going to cover that cost. Anecdotally, all I can tell you is anecdotally, where organisations have had in place their own paid leave entitlement, whether under policy or enterprise agreements, and we're talking large organisations a lot of the time. Anecdotally, what they have told me is that there hasn't been a huge uptake in the paid leave. You might have a day here or there, but what we do here is that it opens the conversation then about how that person can remain engaged with work and what supports they can have in the workplace. Because, as I said before, work is often a real lifeline to individuals experiencing FDV, and they want to stay at work. So they might use a little bit of leave, but are they going to use 10 days every single year? I think it's highly unlikely. So I understand the concern, absolutely, but I think it's unlikely we're going to see an opening of the floodgates. And hopefully what we see more of is just these sorts of conversations and the supports being put in place so that people can remain at work.
Indeed, indeed. Georgie, there is a lot of questions that have been presented to me. There's probably about 15 questions or so. So I might just choose a couple for you to answer now, particularly if I can just scan through quickly and see if there's common questions. But it's quite clear that we're going to have to provide some Q&A back after this session. So a company that specialises in labour hire, where all of their workers are casual, is there any evidence required to be provided to be permitted to take the leave, i.e. a doctor's certificate? That's the first part of the question. If you'd perhaps like to answer that one now.
Yes, so look, if it's a direct employee of a labour hire provider and they're seeking to take family and domestic violence leave, you can require evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that they're taking leave for the reason asserted. So it might be a medical certificate if that's the thing that they needed to do that they couldn't do outside of working hours. So absolutely, you are able to require evidence if that's appropriate in the circumstances. And further to my earlier comment, I always suggest you exercise discretion, but certainly if you had any concerns, then you are able to ask for that evidence.
Yep, and store that documentation, I'm assuming, Georgie.
Yes, and it has to be stored confidential on a confidential server or what have you, where others can't access it. Yeah.
Yep, needs to know basis. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the second part of the question is the 10 days per employer or per person per year, which is an important question for a labour hire firm where they might be working for multiple agencies.
Yeah, so it's 10 days with a particular employer. So they could potentially get it at a number of different sites, but I suppose on a practical level, if they're only doing occasional work for you, then it's less likely they're going to be taking the leave, you know, up to the 10 days if they're doing work with lots of other organisations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And one more, and this has been asked a couple of times as well. The rest we will answer, Georgie, if you don't mind Q&A, and we can send it with the recording today. Does the full rate of pay include salesperson commissions that they may have typically received? And I know when you mentioned full rate, I suspect the questions come from that section.
Yeah, so it can include additional incentives and the like. Let me just pull up that definition again. So it can include incentive-based payments and bonuses. So I guess it would depend on the nature of the payment that was being made, but it would be what they would have, effectively what they would have got paid had they been at work on that particular day.
Yeah, okay, that would be interesting to measure, particularly for things like sales commissions, but I will leave that to others way smarter than me to manage. I think we've kind of taken up a lot of your time, Georgie, and I think what might be appropriate is to just answer these questions back to the audience in a timely fashion. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Lovely speaking to you, and thank you for explaining the practical strategies of how companies can administer and manage such a sensitive, but as you noted, complex topic. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. As I mentioned, you'll receive a copy of this recording for yourselves and also to share with your teams. Along with that, we will send you a fact sheet that's been prepared by Georgie, and also we'll answer these questions that have been presented to us today. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and again, thank you so much to Georgie.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.